Okay, now sort of on the final stages of ontological Christology, we're looking at the last major section, which is technically Christology Part 3. Part 1 was Introduction and Deity. Part 2 is the humanity of Christ, or his human nature. Now, Part 3, which is still part of this module, is the Hypostatic Union. So how do we put deity and humanity together? Okay, so I already mentioned this in the Incarnation, because remember the phrase that he never ceased being what he was, but began to be what he was not. So again, he never ceased being the full second person of the Trinity with all his attributes, but he began to be what he was not. And just to sort of, I'll give you a little homework project here. We finished with things like the virgin birth and the kenosis. Remember, the idea is he's in the form of God, in the form of man. He's in the morphe theos, right? Morphe and morphe doulou, form of God, form of man, two natures. You get an interesting glimpse of this in Matthew 17 in the Transfiguration passage, where it just shows he's still fully divine, fully human, because the entire passage in Matthew 17 that talks about his transfiguration, the word transfigure is metamorphao. It's literally a change of morphes. It's a change of form. Where, again, Peter, James, and John are there, and at first they're beholding his morphe doulou in the likeness of men, aka his human nature, which in the physical world is occluding their vision of God. The transfiguration, or the metamorphosis, the exchange of forms, this bright shining Christ they see now is the reflection of his divine morphe, or glory. So that's why, again, when John says what? We beheld his glory. Glory is of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. Guess what? Yeah, John was there. He beheld his glory. So think of kenosis there. Again, two morphes. Look at that in light of Matthew 17 and the metamorphao, the transfiguration. So when we think about that, we fast forward to, again, working thing. Never ceased being what he was, but began to be what he was not. Now, when we get to the hypostatic union, because this is probably the more technical aspect of Christology, is that we're going to have to define a lot of terms here. And again, this is on the handout, Part 3, the unipersonality of Christ in the hypostatic union. So I'm going to go through a couple of ideas and definitions here. And so why don't you follow along with me in the handout. The hypostatic union is defined here as the assumption of a human nature by the pre-existent eternal person of the Son of God in such a way as to draw the human nature into the oneness of the divine person without division or separation of the natures, but also without change or confusion of the natures. Okay? What is this? It's basically a restatement of the Chalcedonian Creed and the Nicene Creed. Okay? That he simply is one person, one subsistent, with two full, true, genuine natures, okay, divine and human. So the hypostatic union, again, that word hypostasis in the history of theological thought, prior to about AD 380, with a group of thinkers called the Cappadocian Fathers, prior to that, the term ousia and hypostasis simply meant nature. After about AD 380, to try and distinguish generally nature from a specific instance of a rational nature person, hypostasis started to be used about that time to indicate person. So when we look at the concept of the hypostatic union, you might just replace the word person or personal 99 times out of 100, and you'll get it right, is that this is the personal union of two natures, okay, that's going on with the hypostatic union. Now, some language here, again, that theologians and Christian thinkers have developed over the last 2,000 years but how do we explain this so that Christ is not two persons? And here's how it ends up. We've got his human nature is anhypostatic, that is not personalized or not subsistent in and of itself, okay? Now, the definition here for anhypostasis is, okay, a term that applies to the human nature of Christ insofar as it has no subsistence or person in and of itself, but rather subsists in the person of the Logos or the Word for the sake of incarnation. Okay, so what does this mean? A lot of ways people debate the concept of personhood. Again, the way I'm using it throughout my theological lectures here is that personhood here is going to be a specific instance of a rational essence where the intellect is going to bend back on itself and have a sense of self-awareness as, again, an act of reflexive awareness, while the intellect can also deliberate about other propositions and objects and other things. So the idea of a person being a specific instance, but also personhood is having a single sense of self-awareness. You are an ego, you have first-person introspective awareness, okay? That's the concept of personhood. To avoid Nestorianism that Jesus is somehow, there's a man Jesus who the man and human nature in and of itself has first-person introspective awareness and is self-aware, and then is indwelt by a divine person who is self-aware eternally in relation to two other persons, the Father and the Spirit. That makes two persons. So what we need to eliminate in the humanity of Christ is some sense of self-subsistence or self-awareness in the human nature. So it's not a we, it's an I, okay? Only one sense of first-person introspective awareness. So the idea here is, first, it's important that the human nature of Jesus never actually exists independent of the Logos. When we see the act of the Holy Spirit, okay, in the sense of the Holy Spirit as the terminus or manifestation of the work of God and the causal agent in the virgin conception, what we see is that arguably is that God, to put it in easy to understand terms, and again, I'm using traducianism as, again, just for the sake of argument. God grabs an entire piece of human nature from the Virgin Mary that is unindividuated, a piece of soul and a piece of her body. Again, full rational powers in the soul, full genetic code, DNA, again, with the body. And does what? Now this union, okay, that's done by God through the activity, and now that the person of Christ is now, again, becomes unionized through this and then now separates. So there's never a time when the full human nature of Christ somehow exists independent from the Logos as an individuated human nature. When it's individuated, it's always in union with the Logos. So now, okay, the human nature is not self-aware in and of itself. That would make two persons. Yet, when you encounter Jesus Christ, he says, I, me, he's self-aware. Where does this sense of subsistence or self-awareness come from? Well, that's where we get en hypostatic, en, hypostatic Christology, and hypostasis, like a negation, hypostasis, non-personal, okay? That describes the human nature. En hypostasis is saying this anhypostatic human nature receives its subsistence or hypostasis or self-awareness in the self-awareness or personality of the Logos. So the human nature is always personalized, okay? But personalized in the personality of the Logos. So the same self-awareness that has existed for all eternity is now providing the self-awareness for the God-man as a whole, okay? There's not a separate sense of self-awareness, okay, in the humanity of Christ. So that's it, and hypostasis and hypostasis. So how do we explain this? Again, very important that we don't need Apollinarianism to explain a functioning God-man. All we really need is not to get rid of a human soul or, again, a soulish spirit, ability of Christ in his humanity to think and to choose in a limited way. Remember that the idea of personhood, as I mentioned earlier, is that in this limited, individuated, rational essence, one of the first operations of the intellect is to bend back on the subject, the substance, and recognize it as an object, giving us first-person introspective awareness. Second operation of the intellect is to deliberate about other objects and ideas, the good, the true, the beautiful. So for Christ, since there's already a sense of self-awareness in the Logos, when you have this union and the personalization of the Logos, what you've got now is an operation of the human intellect to think in limited ways about the good, the true, the beautiful, about human choices. But you do not need a second sense of what? Of reflection or self-awareness, the reflective awareness of the human nature on itself and in and of itself. Why? Because you already have self-awareness grounded in the Logos, and the human nature is not independent of the Logos and subsisting or existing independently. So one sense of self-awareness. So all we ever eliminate in the person of Christ is a single operation or activity that is common to every other human being, which is that reflexive sense of self-awareness. It's an activity or an operation, not a property or a power of human nature. So he maintains a full human nature, full human essence, okay, with respect to his soul. So what we have is hypostatic Christology, where the second person of the Trinity, with his eternal sense of self-awareness in relationship to the Father and the Son always knows he is the Son and not the Father and the Holy Spirit, that he assumes this human nature, arguably through the activity or mechanism of the virgin conception, and that takes a piece of human nature, individuates it. The human nature never stands independent, so the human nature is never self-aware or self-subsistent. So you end up with a Christ who is fully God, fully man, who is one person, and the divine and human natures remain distinct. Again, there is, like with the Trinity, there is no exact analogy for this whatsoever, okay? Why? Very simply put, because there's nothing else like a God-man. There is no other being that has two complete rational natures and yet is one person. So, like with the Trinity, there is no other single substance that is three persons at the same time. That's why there is no perfect analogy. But I'll give something that, don't press this too far, but let's just say that when you put on a costume or a persona, right? Let's just say you put on your Batman costume. Basically, it's still you in the Batman suit, even though you take on the full persona of Batman, right? You're Bruce Wayne and now you're Batman, okay? Well, let's say that the Logos now has a full human nature Jesus suit hanging in the closet, okay, that is not self-aware. When when the Logos puts on the Jesus suit, okay, that now what we have is a personalized human nature at that point, and a specific human persona that is assumed by a pre-existent person, okay? That's the idea of hypostatic humanity and self-awareness. Now, in the next segment, I'm going to look at concepts of communication of attributes, divine subconsciousness, and a few things like that. But if you can nail down this first part here of what the concept of hypostatic union and hypostatic humanity and hypostatic humanity, and then the concept of what it means to be a subsistent, to be self-aware, the activities of the human soul, self-awareness, modes of consciousness, all of a sudden it all makes sense, right? Okay, which by the way, if you don't get all this the first time, that's okay. Okay, the fact is you might have to meditate on this a while, and then all of a sudden you'll have some nice aha moments once you do that. Once you master each of these steps and can put them together, you have a really fully coherent understanding of how Christ can be a God-man. So next segment, again, we'll look at other concepts of communication of attributes and other related things. Thanks.